Hello, I'm Christopher Jenkins. I'm Senior Partner of Wingrave Yeats, a medium-sized firm of accountants based in W1. I in particular specialise in helping small businesses grow quicker and faster than they would otherwise perhaps done if they hadn't taken my advice.
Christopher, thank you very much for being with us today. Can you tell us what makes an MBO different as a buyout?
MBOs are fascinating transactions as far as I'm concerned. I think probably the key thing about them is that you have a situation where the vendor knows the purchaser very well because of course they've worked with them for some years perhaps. And the other thing is that very few transactions tend to suit both buyer and seller. But I find that in the case of an MBO, it's often the case that actually we can arrange things so that both parties come out very well. It's rather a glib thing to say perhaps that one might be able to buy a company for nothing, but let me say to you that that is sometimes possible in a situation where there is an MBO that can be arranged. And what I mean by that is that in a lot of business, a lot of transactions, it is the price that is the determining factor. But with an MBO, it is often the case that one can manage the transaction over a period of time so that the buyer can actually pay for the company that they're buying out of the future profits of the business and perhaps raise far less cash than they would otherwise have done if this was just a normal third-party transaction.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, I was involved in the buyout advising the management team of a TV production company, quite a well-known one, so I'm afraid I won't be telling you what the name is. But that happened about just over a year ago, and it was an interesting one really because the vendor, the existing owner, appeared to be asking a very large price for the business, and I think one which, if one had looked at it dispassionately, might have felt was too much for everybody concerned, and particularly would have been if the buyers, the management team, had to produce the cash on day one. But the nice thing about this was that one of the stipulations that was agreed, which did in fact suit both parties in the end, was that the purchase price could be delivered over a number of years, in this case actually up till 10 years. And so I suppose the deal for the buyer was, well, if I don't have to put up very much cash myself, then I would have been working in this business anyway as a manager. I'm going to continue to work in it now, and if after 6 or 7 years I'm able to reduce the purchase price, well, that's a very attractive deal for me because I end up with ownership of the company I would have been working for as a manager.
And as a management team, what are the things that you need to do to prepare in advance?
I think they're much the same as they would be for any corporate transaction, but of course an MBO is a particular type of one and there are special considerations for it. Probably the most important point is choosing the right team. And what I mean by that in this case is that you are already working with people for several years, and at the point at which perhaps you decide that you want to do a management buyout, you will start talking to your fellow board members, the people who work around you. And one of the problems is this, that if you engage too many people in that sort of thinking, they of course will assume that they're going to be part of your management team. It may be that they are not the best people to form part of your team. And don't forget that if you are actually arranging finance, then other people, particularly the banks and possibly even external financiers if you are choosing to take them on, will be very interested in the quality of your team. And it may well be that people who have been working with you up till now are not suitable. They may not be impressive enough in terms of their experience, and particularly they may not be the sort of people who are capable of running their own business, because of course you make a big transition from working for somebody else to working for yourself, and therefore try and be very careful about who you involve in the discussions, because it's very difficult to deselect people. It's a very painful thing to talk to people who you've been working for a long time and say, look, I'm terribly sorry, Alexandra, whoever it is, you're not going to be on our team anymore. And so I think that's something you need to think about very, very early on in your deliberations.
And what about raising of finance?
Well, of course, raising finance is particularly important, as I said, in any deal. I think with this, it's again, it comes down to a problem of assuming that things are going to be all right because the environment doesn't change too much, that you're dealing with a vendor who, i.e. the current owner of the business, who is going to be nice to you. Of course they're going to sort you out. Well, there's only one thing that stops an MBO dead in its tracks, and that is lack of cash. Lack of cash either because you can't provide the instalment that's required under the agreement, or the business itself, which runs short of money. And you can't always rely on someone who was a friend of yours working within business bailing you out. You are in a very privileged position when you're conducting the negotiations of an MBO, simply because you have perfect knowledge of the business, which is often not the case if you're buying a business from a third party. And I think the other point to make is that you have plenty of time to do your due diligence and to think very carefully about the agreement, because you are the preferred buyer, because the current owner will allow you sufficient time to get all these issues absolutely straight. So you really must not be lulled into a false sense of security. You must take the time to get the money sorted out.
And how about your negotiations with the vendor? What should you look out for?
Well, that's the point really, isn't it? I think you put your finger on it, because just as I said, the close relationship with the vendor allows some particularly interesting deals to be done under the guise of an MBO. So indeed there are a certain number of dangers. One of the dangers is that you will get railroaded into taking the bad with the good. If you were a dispassionate third-party buyer, you would come in, dictate your terms, tell them what you wanted to buy and what you weren't going to buy, and walk away if the deal wasn't right for you. In this case, it's very much more difficult, because you'll be persuaded to take your own baggage with you. Those pet projects that you've been working on perhaps for the last couple of years, which are not quite as successful as you'd hoped, the current owner will not wish to be left with. You will probably have to take on the leases of the buildings because you're there already, and all those issues, I think, need to be sorted out very early on in the negotiations, I think. And I think the final point I'd make is that again, it has to do with the incestuous nature of the relationship between buyer and seller. If, for example, the seller, the current owner, suggests to you perhaps that you might want to use his or her accountants, his or her lawyers, not necessarily at the final transaction, because of course there might be a conflict of interest, but of course leading up to that, let's all talk about this together. I would say no. I would say no, because you really need to stand apart from the person who you're buying the company from.
Okay. And finally, what are the considerations after you've completed the MBO?
Well, again, how does that compare? What's the difference between an MBO and a normal transaction? I think once the deal is done, you've got to live with it, and jolly good luck to you, because it's going to be very difficult. It's always much more difficult than you might think it's going to be. I suppose there's one thing I should say about an MBO, is that precisely because you know the seller, there is a chance, and I wouldn't rely on this, and I hesitate to say it, but there is the availability, there is the option to be able to go back to the seller and renegotiate if everything falls apart and there is no other option. I'm assuming, of course, that this is a situation where consideration is payable out of future profits over a period of time, and of course the seller will want that transaction to complete. And I think if you show yourself to be incapable, the chances are that you'll have the business taken off you. But at least there is that possibility, which I don't believe would exist in a normal transaction, where the seller will have taken his money and will have disappeared, and you are left very much on your own. So again, another consolation, perhaps another nice aspect to an MBO.
Christopher, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.